The dust was so thick in Beatrice's throat that she could barely swallow, but the knot of fear lodged there had nothing to do with the California heat and everything to do with the eviction notice clutched in her trembling hands. San Pedro, California, 1878. The coastal town had seemed like a promise when Beatrice Ann arrived 6 months ago, fleeing memories of a failed engagement and a family scandal back in Boston. The Pacific breezes should have been refreshing, should have carried hope on their salt-tinged currents, but instead they whispered of her failures. 22 years old and already considered a ruined woman in polite society, she had scraped together every penny to make the journey west, believing she could reinvent herself where no one knew her name or her shame. The boarding house room she rented from Mrs. Chen was small but clean, with a window overlooking the harbor where ships came and went with their holds full of possibility. Beatrice had found work as a seamstress, her quick fingers and careful stitches earning her enough to pay for room and board with a few coins left over. Or they had, until the shipping company closed and half the town found themselves without steady income. The wives who had once commissioned her services now mended their own clothes, and Beatrice watched her savings dwindle like water in the desert. Now those savings were gone entirely. The notice demanded payment within 3 days, or she would find herself on the street. $45. It might as well have been $400. She had $12.30 to her name, and no prospects for earning the rest in time. Beatrice folded the notice carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, smoothing down the worn fabric with hands that had become rough from work. She would not cry. She had shed enough tears over the past year to fill the harbor, and they had accomplished nothing except to make her eyes red and her nose swollen. Instead, she squared her shoulders and descended the narrow stairs to the street below. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she walked toward the main thoroughfare, past the general store and the saloon, past the livery stable where horses stamped and snorted in the heat. She had one option left, distasteful as it was. Mr. Thornton at the Pacific Bank had offered her a loan once before, though the gleam in his eye when he looked at her had made her skin crawl. She had refused then, but desperation was a powerful motivator. The bank was housed in one of the newer buildings, its false front painted a crisp white that stood out against the weathered wood of its neighbors. Beatrice paused at the door, gathering her courage, then pushed inside. The interior was blessedly cool, and she took a moment to let her eyes adjust to the dimness. Mr. Thornton sat behind his desk, his round face glistening with perspiration, despite the shade. He looked up at her entrance, and that same unsettling gleam appeared in his small eyes. "Miss Ann," he said, rising with exaggerated courtesy. "What a pleasant surprise. Have you reconsidered my offer?" "I need to discuss the possibility of a loan," Beatrice said, keeping her voice steady. "I find myself in temporary financial difficulty." "Temporary," Mr. Thornton repeated, coming around the desk to stand too close. "That's what they all say. But let's be honest, Miss Ann, a woman alone, with no family and no steady employment, that's not a temporary situation. That's a permanent condition." Heat rose in Beatrice's cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm a skilled seamstress. Once the economy improves, once. He waved a dismissive hand. "I deal in certainties, not possibilities. However, as I mentioned before, I might be persuaded to help you, for a price." The way he said the last words made Beatrice's stomach turn. "What kind of price?" He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Nothing too onerous. Companionship. You're a handsome woman, Miss Ann, if a bit past your prime for marriage. A man gets lonely in a rough town like this. I'd be willing to provide you with a monthly stipend in exchange for your company." Beatrice took a step backward. "I'm not interested in that kind of arrangement." "Then I'm afraid I cannot help you." His smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "And I should warn you, I've spoken to Mrs. Chen. She's planning to rent your room to a gentleman from Sacramento, willing to pay double your rate. So you see, even if you could scrape together this month's rent, you'd only be delaying the inevitable." The words hit her like a physical blow. Beatrice turned and fled the bank. Her vision blurring with tears, she refused to let fall. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her away from the main street toward the quieter edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrubland, and the sound of the ocean grew louder. She found herself at the small Catholic church, a modest structure with a cross that caught the afternoon light. Father Miguel was kind, but the church was as poor as its congregants. He could offer prayers and perhaps a meal, but not the money she needed. Beatrice sat on the steps and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her despair. She had come so far, worked so hard, and for what? To end up worse off than she had started, alone and penniless in a town that didn't care whether she lived or died. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on those shoulders." The voice startled her, and she looked up to find a man standing a respectful distance away. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that fell to his collar beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes marked him as a working man, a cowboy by the looks of his worn boots and the dust that clung to his denim trousers. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking blue-green like the ocean on a clear day, and filled with genuine concern. "I'm fine," Beatrice said automatically, then reconsidered. What was the point in lying? "Actually, I'm very far from fine, but I don't see how it concerns you." "It doesn't," he admitted, and she appreciated the honesty. "But my mama raised me to offer help when I see someone in need. Name's Blake Xavier. I work the cattle ranch about 5 miles north of here." "Beatrice Ann." She didn't offer her hand, and he didn't seem to expect it. "And unless you're in need of sewing services, I don't think you can help me." Blake Xavier tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "What kind of trouble are you in, Miss Ann, if you don't mind my asking?" She should have told him to mind his own business. Instead, she found herself explaining her situation, the words spilling out in a rush. The lost employment, the mounting debt, the eviction notice, even the degrading proposition from Mr. Thornton. She hadn't meant to share so much, but there was something about his steady presence that invited confidence. When she finished, Blake was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, $45. "Yes, which I don't have and cannot earn in 3 days. And Mrs. Chen, she runs the boarding house on Harbor Street." Beatrice nodded, wondering why that mattered. Blake Xavier pulled at his lower lip, thinking. Then he seemed to come to a decision. "I can't give you the money," he said, and her heart sank. Of course he couldn't. Why had she even hoped? "But that doesn't mean you won't get it. Have faith, Miss Ann. Things have a way of working out." It was the sort of empty platitude people offered when they wanted to feel helpful without actually doing anything. Beatrice stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Xavier." "Blake," he said, "and I mean it about the faith." She walked away without responding, heading back toward the boarding house with heavy steps. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if she had the heart to appreciate them. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen when Beatrice returned, preparing the evening meal. The older woman looked up with sympathy in her dark eyes. "You received my notice," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did. Mrs. Chen, please, if you could give me just a few more days. I am sorry, Beatrice, truly. But I have bills of my own to pay, and the gentleman from Sacramento has already put down a deposit. If you can pay what you owe by Friday, the room is yours. If not..." She spread her hands helplessly. Friday was 3 days away. Beatrice climbed the stairs to her room and closed the door, leaning against it as the reality of her situation crashed over her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The thought of Mr. Thornton's proposition made her skin crawl. But what choice did she have? At least it would keep a roof over her head. No, she couldn't. She wouldn't. Beatrice changed out of her good dress and into her nightgown, though it was barely evening. She couldn't bear to go downstairs for supper, couldn't stomach the pitying looks from the other boarders, who had surely heard of her predicament by now. Instead, she climbed into bed and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, staring at the ceiling as the light faded from the sky. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to the sound of voices below her window. Male voices, one of them Mrs. Chen's husband. Beatrice rose and pressed her ear to the floor, but she could only make out fragments. Something about payment, about the room, about keeping quiet. Then silence. The next morning, Beatrice woke early and dressed with care, steeling herself for another day of searching for work or solutions. She was halfway down the stairs when Mrs. Chen called out to her. "Miss Ann, a moment, please." Beatrice entered the kitchen to find Mrs. Chen and her husband both wearing expressions of confusion mixed with satisfaction. "The most extraordinary thing has happened, Mrs. Chen said. "Last evening a man came to the door. He paid your rent in full, Miss Ann, all $45 plus an additional month in advance." Beatrice's legs went weak, and she grabbed the back of a chair for support. "What? Who? Who was it?" Mr. Chen shook his head. "He would not give his name, said only that your debt was paid and that we were not to tell you who had helped. Insisted on it, in fact. Made us promise." "But that's impossible. I don't know anyone who would—" She trailed off, her mind racing. Could it have been Father Miguel? No, the church had no money. One of the other boarders? They were all struggling themselves. Mr. Thornton? The thought made her ill, but surely even he wouldn't demand anonymity if he wanted something in return. "What did he look like?" Beatrice demanded. Mrs. Chen and her husband exchanged glances. "Tall," Mr. Chen said finally. "It was dark. We did not see clearly. But you must have seen something. His clothes, his face, anything. Miss Ann, he asked us not to identify him," Mrs. Chen said gently. "We gave our word. What matters is that your rent is paid, and you are safe. Perhaps you should simply be grateful for this blessing." Beatrice wanted to argue, to insist they tell her everything, but she could see from their expressions that they would not break their promise. She thanked them with a voice that shook and returned to her room, her mind whirling. Someone had saved her. Someone had given her 2 months of security without asking for anything in return, without even wanting recognition. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, and yet it had happened. She thought of Blake Xavier and his words the previous afternoon. "Have faith, Miss Ann. Things have a way of working out." Had he known something would happen, or had he been the one to pay? No, that seemed too fantastical. They had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes. Why would a stranger hand over such a significant sum for someone he didn't even know? And cowhands didn't make that kind of money anyway, not enough to spare $90 on a whim. Still, she couldn't shake the thought. The timing was too coincidental. She needed to find Blake Xavier and at least eliminate him as a possibility. Beatrice spent the morning making inquiries. The ranch he had mentioned turned out to be the Double J, owned by a man named Joseph Jennings. She walked the 5 miles in the afternoon heat, grateful for the sea breeze that made the journey bearable. The Double J was larger than she had expected, with a sprawling ranch house and several outbuildings. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and she could see riders moving among them in the distance. She approached the main house and knocked on the door. A woman in her 50s answered, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Can I help you, dear?" "I'm looking for Blake Xavier. I was told he works here." "He does indeed. One of our best hands. Is there a problem?" "No, I just needed to speak with him about a personal matter." The woman studied her with open curiosity, but didn't pry. "He's out checking the fence line in the south pasture. Won't be back until evening. You're welcome to wait, or you can come back tomorrow." Beatrice hesitated. The walk had already tired her, and the thought of retracing her steps only to return again was daunting. Would it be possible to get a message to him? "I can have one of the boys ride out, but it'll cost you some time either way. Tell you what, come inside and have some water and rest yourself. We can send someone to fetch him." The offer was too tempting to refuse. Beatrice followed the woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Jennings, into a spacious kitchen where preparations for the evening meal were underway. "A young lady walking all this way in the heat," Mrs. Jennings said, shaking her head. "Must be important." "It is," Beatrice said, accepting a glass of cool water. "Or at least, I think it might be." Mrs. Jennings sent one of the ranch hands to find Blake, and Beatrice settled in to wait. The older woman was easy to talk to, and soon Beatrice found herself sharing more than she had intended about her circumstances. Not the specifics of the mysterious payment, but enough about her struggles to make work in San Pedro. "You're a seamstress?" Mrs. Jennings said thoughtfully. "My daughter and I have been trying to find someone skilled with a needle. We've got a whole trunk of fabric we bought with grand plans, but neither of us has the talent to make anything worth wearing. Would you be interested in some work?" Beatrice felt hope bloom in her chest. "Yes, absolutely. What did you have in mind?" They were discussing details when the door opened and Blake Xavier walked in, his hat in his hands and confusion on his face. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Beatrice. "Miss Ann, I didn't expect to see you here." "Mr. Xavier." She stood, suddenly uncertain. Now that he was in front of her, her question seemed foolish. "I apologize for interrupting your work. I wanted to ask you something." Mrs.? Jennings glanced between them with interest. I'll leave you two to talk. Miss Ann, come back on Saturday and we'll go through that trunk properly. When they were alone, Blake leaned against the doorframe, studying Beatrice with those ocean-colored eyes. What did you want to ask me? Yesterday, after we spoke, something happened. Someone paid my rent, anonymously. The timing seemed... She trailed off, unsure how to continue without sounding presumptuous. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by something she couldn't quite read. And you thought it might have been me. I don't know what to think. It seems impossible that it's just coincidence. Blake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said carefully, Why does it matter who paid it? You're safe, you have a place to live. Isn't that enough? Of course it matters. Someone gave me $90 and I don't even know who to thank. I need to pay them back. I need to... Maybe they don't want to be thanked. His voice was gentle but firm. Maybe they did it because it was the right thing to do, not because they expected anything in return. That's easy to say when you're not the one who feels like a charity case. Is that what you think? That accepting help makes you less somehow? Blake shook his head. Miss Ann, we all need help sometimes. There's no shame in that. You're not answering my question, Beatrice said. Did you pay my rent? Blake met her eyes steadily. If I had, and I'd asked the Chens not to tell you, why would I admit it now? That would defeat the whole purpose, wouldn't it? It wasn't a denial, but it wasn't a confession either. Beatrice felt frustration rise in her throat. So, you're saying you won't tell me? I'm saying it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're safe and you have the chance to get back on your feet. Mrs. Jennings mentioned she might have work for you. Yes, but that's not... Then focus on that. Focus on the future, not on who did what in the past. He straightened, settling his hat back on his head. I need to get back to work, but Miss Ann, I'm glad things worked out for you. I mean that. He left before she could respond, and Beatrice was left standing in the kitchen with more questions than answers. His non-answer felt like an answer in itself, but she couldn't be sure. And if it had been him, why wouldn't he just admit it? Why the secrecy? The walk back to town gave her plenty of time to think. The mysterious benefactor occupied her thoughts to the point of distraction. She tried to make lists in her head of who it could be, but every name seemed unlikely. She had no wealthy friends, no family on the coast, no one who owed her such a debt. Unless it was Blake Xavier. He was the only new element, the only person who had appeared in her life at exactly the right moment. But why? What did he gain from helping her? The question plagued her through the evening and into the next day. Friday came and went. The deadline she had been dreading now, just another date. She had her room, she had the promise of work from Mrs. Jennings, and she had a mystery that consumed her thoughts. Saturday found her back at the Double G, this time by invitation. Mrs. Jennings and her daughter Lily, a cheerful young woman of 20, brought out the trunk of fabric with obvious excitement. There were bolts of calico and gingham, fine cotton, and even a length of silk that must have cost a fortune. We went a bit mad at the merchants, Lily admitted with a laugh. But we have grand plans for new dresses, and Mother said you're the person to make them reality. Beatrice spent the afternoon taking measurements and discussing designs. The work was exactly what she needed, both financially and emotionally. It gave her purpose, a focus beyond her mystery benefactor. Blake Xavier appeared briefly at lunch, eating quickly at the long table where the ranch hands gathered. He nodded to Beatrice but didn't approach, and she found herself watching him more than she should. He had an easy manner with the other men, quick to laugh at their jokes, and just as quick to defend when one of the younger hands was teased too harshly. Blake's a good man, Mrs. Jennings said quietly, following Beatrice's gaze. Been with us almost 2 years now. Best hand we've ever had. But more than that, he's got character. You can't always say that about the men who drift through. He seems very private, Beatrice ventured. That he is. Doesn't talk much about where he came from or what brought him to California. But he works hard, treats everyone fair, and he's got a gentle hand with the horses. She paused. Why do you ask? Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. No particular reason. He was kind to me when we met, that's all. Mrs. Jennings smiled knowingly, but didn't press further. Over the following weeks, Beatrice fell into a routine. She worked on the dresses for the Jennings women, took on additional sewing projects from other ranch families in the area, and slowly rebuilt her savings. The mysterious payment that had saved her faded from the immediate forefront of her thoughts, though it never disappeared entirely. She saw Blake occasionally when she visited the Double J. Their conversations were brief and polite, but there was an undercurrent to them that Beatrice couldn't quite name. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find him watching her with an expression of quiet contentment. Other times she would catch herself looking for him, disappointed when he was out on the range. "You should come to the dance next Saturday," Lily said one afternoon, while Beatrice was fitting her for a new dress. "The whole town turns out. It's quite fun." "I don't know," Beatrice said around the pins in her mouth. "I'm not much for social gatherings." "Oh, come on. You've been working yourself to the bone. You deserve an evening of fun. Besides, there will be plenty of eligible men there." She winked. "I've seen the way you look at Blake Xavier." Beatrice nearly swallowed a pin. "I don't look at him any particular way." "Sure you don't. And he doesn't find excuses to come by the house whenever you're here working either." Lily's grin was infectious. "You should come. I bet he'd ask you to dance." The thought both thrilled and terrified Beatrice. She had sworn off romance after the disaster with her former fiancé, a Boston banker's son, who had courted her passionately until his family discovered her father's gambling debts. The broken engagement had been humiliating enough, but the rumors that followed, suggestions that she had somehow trapped him or behaved improperly, had been worse. But Blake Xavier wasn't anything like Edward Hartwell. Blake was honest where Edward had been calculating, straightforward where Edward had been manipulative. And the way Blake looked at her sometimes made her heart do strange things in her chest. "I'll think about it," Beatrice conceded, and Lily squealed with delight. The dance was held in the town hall, a large room that had been decorated with streamers and lanterns. A small band played fiddle music in the corner, and tables laden with food lined one wall. Beatrice arrived with Mrs. Chen and some of the other boarders, feeling conspicuous in her best dress, a dove gray cotton with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. The room was already crowded, filled with ranching families and townsfolk, all eager for entertainment. Beatrice recognized several faces, including Mr. Thornton, who watched her with a mixture of surprise and something darker. She turned away deliberately, refusing to let him spoil her evening. "Beatrice, you came!" Lily appeared at her elbow, radiant in one of the dresses Beatrice had made for her, a cheerful yellow calico that complemented her coloring perfectly. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people." Beatrice allowed herself to be pulled into the crowd, meeting ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers and their daughters. Everyone was friendly, curious about the seamstress who had been working up at the Double J. She was in the middle of a conversation with the butcher's wife when the room seemed to shift slightly. Blake Xavier had arrived. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt and trousers that, while still obviously work clothes, were free of dust and wear. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the crowd, and when his eyes found Beatrice, his face broke into a smile that made her breath catch. He crossed the room to her, ignoring several young women who tried to catch his attention along the way. "Miss Ann," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. "You look lovely this evening. Mr. Xavier, I didn't know you attended these functions. Usually I don't, but I heard from a reliable source that you might be here, and I thought I'd make an exception." His eyes held a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Would you like to dance?" She should have said no. Should have remembered all the reasons she had sworn off men and romance. Should have protected her heart. Instead, she said, "I'd like that very much." Blake led her onto the floor as the band struck up a waltz. His hand was warm on her waist, his grip on her hand firm but gentle. He moved with surprising grace for a cowboy, leading her through the steps with confidence. "Where did you learn to dance?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. "My mother insisted all her children learn, said it was a mark of civilization, even on a ranch in the middle of nowhere." His expression grew distant for a moment. "She passed 5 years ago, but I think she'd be pleased I remembered her lessons." "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. She was a good woman, strong, kind, stubborn as a mule when she believed in something." He smiled. "You remind me of her a little." "Is that so? Should I be flattered or concerned?" "Definitely flattered. She was one of the finest people I've ever known." They danced in comfortable silence for a few moments, and Beatrice found herself relaxing into the music and the movement. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to simply enjoy something, to be present in a moment without worrying about the future or dwelling on the past. Can I ask you something? Blake said quietly. Of course. Why did you come to California? A woman alone, traveling all the way from Boston, that takes courage, or desperation. Beatrice stiffened slightly, but his expression held only curiosity, no judgment. Both, I suppose. I needed a fresh start, somewhere no one knew me or my history. Bad history? The usual kind for a woman in my position. A broken engagement, family scandal, wagging tongues. Nothing criminal, just enough to make life unbearable. She met his eyes. What about you? Mrs. Jennings said you've been at the Double J for 2 years, but you don't talk about before. Touché. He grinned. Fair enough. I came west after my mother died. My father remarried quickly, too quickly, and his new wife made it clear there wasn't room for me in their new life. So I moved on, been working ranches ever since, moving from place to place until I found the Double J. Mr. and Mrs. Jennings are good people. They've given me a reason to stay put for a while. No other reasons? The question slipped out before Beatrice could stop it. Too bold, too revealing. Blake's hand tightened slightly on her waist. Maybe 1 or 2 developing, he said softly. The song ended, but they remained on the floor for the next one, and the one after that. Beatrice was dimly aware of people watching them, of whispered conversations and knowing looks. But she found she didn't care. Dancing with Blake felt right in a way nothing had felt right in a very long time. When they finally took a break, Blake brought her a glass of punch and they found a spot along the wall where they could talk without shouting over the music. I have a confession to make, Blake said, his expression turning serious. Actually, more of a question I need to ask you. Beatrice's heart began to pound. What is it? That night, when your rent was paid, you were so determined to figure out who did it. Has the mystery been bothering you all this time? Yes, she admitted. I know it's foolish, but I can't let it go. Someone helped me when I was at my lowest point, and I don't even know who to thank. It feels wrong somehow, like an unfinished story. Blake was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were wrestling with something internal. Finally, he said, What if I told you that whoever did it doesn't want thanks? That they did it because they saw someone in need and had the means to help. Nothing more complicated than that. You're saying I should just accept it and move on. I'm saying that gratitude doesn't always need a recipient. Sometimes it's enough to be grateful to the universe, or God, or whatever you believe in. And maybe, if you really want to honor what was done for you, you could pay it forward someday, help someone else when they need it. It was good advice, wise even, but it didn't satisfy the gnawing need in Beatrice's chest to know, to understand. She studied Blake's face, looking for confirmation of her suspicions, but his expression gave nothing away. Why won't you just tell me? She asked softly. If it was you, why the secrecy? I never said it was me. You never said it wasn't either. Blake's lips quirked in a small smile. Let it go, Beatrice. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice sent a shiver through her. She wanted to press the issue, to demand a straight answer, but something in his eyes stopped her. Whatever his reasons for secrecy, they mattered to him, and increasingly, what mattered to him was beginning to matter to her. Dance with me again, she said instead, and the relief that flashed across his face told her she had made the right choice. They danced until late into the evening, until Beatrice's feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. Other men asked her to dance and she obliged out of politeness, but she always found her way back to Blake, drawn to him like iron to a magnet. When the evening finally wound down and people began to drift toward home, Blake offered to walk Beatrice back to the boarding house. They strolled through the quiet streets, the sound of the ocean, a constant whisper in the background. I had a wonderful time tonight, Beatrice said as they reached her door. So did I. More wonderful than I expected, actually. Blake hesitated, then reached for her hand. I'd like to see you again, not just in passing at the ranch, but properly. May I call on you? Beatrice's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from the possibility of hurt. But when she looked at Blake, at the hope and vulnerability in his expression, she found herself nodding. I'd like that. His smile was brilliant even in the dim light. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Beatrice. Good night, Blake. She watched him walk away until he disappeared into the darkness, then climbed the stairs to her room with a heart that felt lighter than it had in months. Over the following weeks, Blake courted Beatrice with a sincerity and patience that both charmed and unsettled her. He called on her at the boarding house, bringing small gifts, wildflowers picked from the hillsides, a pretty stone he'd found by the creek, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. They took walks along the beach, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Blake told her about growing up on a ranch in Nevada, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the endless sky and the hard work that never quite felt like work when you loved it. Beatrice shared stories of Boston, of the strict society rules and the suffocating expectations, of feeling like she never quite fit the mold she was supposed to fill. "Do you miss it?" Blake asked one afternoon as they sat on the rocks overlooking the harbor. "The city, the society?" "Sometimes," Beatrice admitted. "I miss my sisters, though we were never as close as we should have been. And I miss the theater, the music. But I don't miss the person I was expected to be there. That version of Beatrice Ann never felt real." "And who's the real Beatrice Ann?" She considered the question. "I'm still figuring that out. But I think she's someone stronger than I gave her credit for. Someone who can survive on her own, who doesn't need a man to define her." "No one needs another person to define them," Blake agreed. "But sometimes sharing your life with someone makes it better than it would be alone. Not because you need them, but because you choose them." The way he looked at her when he said it made Beatrice's throat tight. She was falling for Blake Xavier, tumbling headfirst into feelings she had sworn off. And the terrifying part was how right it felt, how natural. But the mystery of her rent payment still nagged at her. She had tried to let it go, as Blake suggested, but it remained like a splinter in her mind, small but persistent. She found herself observing Blake for signs, for any indication that he had been her mysterious benefactor. He lived simply, that much was clear. His room at the ranch was sparse, furnished with only the basics. He saved most of his wages, mentioning once that he hoped to have his own piece of land someday. Could he have afforded $90? It would have been a significant portion of his savings, possibly all of it. The thought both warmed and distressed her. If he had spent everything to help her, it was the most selfless thing anyone had ever done for her. But it also meant he had sacrificed his dreams for someone he barely knew, and that felt like too heavy a burden to bear. One evening, about 2 months after the dance, Blake arrived at the boarding house with an unusually serious expression. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Somewhere private?" They walked to the church, the same steps where they had first met, and sat as the sun began its descent. "What's wrong?" Beatrice asked, anxiety knotting her stomach. "Nothing's wrong exactly. I just need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you'll take it." Blake removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a nervous gesture she had never seen from him before. "I'm in love with you, Beatrice." The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. "I know it's fast," Blake continued when she didn't respond. "I know we've only known each other a few months, but I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You're smart and strong and kind, and when I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before." "Blake, let me finish, please." He met her eyes, and the raw emotion in them took her breath away. "I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm not even asking you to feel the same way. I just needed you to know, because I can't keep pretending this is just a casual courtship when every moment with you feels like the most important moment of my life." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to say she felt the same way, wanted to throw her arms around him and never let go. But fear held her back. The memory of Edward Hartwell and his betrayal, the knowledge that love could hurt more than anything else in the world. "I care about you," she said carefully, "more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. But Blake, I'm scared. The last time I let myself love someone, it destroyed me. I don't know if I can survive that again." "I'm not him," Blake said firmly. "I'm not whoever hurt you. I would never use your feelings against you, Beatrice. I would never abandon you or make you feel less than you are. You say that now, but people change. Circumstances change. Some things don't change. The way I feel about you, that's not going to change." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. Loving someone is terrifying because it means giving them the power to hurt you, but it also means giving them the power to make you happier than you've ever been. Isn't that worth the risk?" Beatrice looked at their joined hands, at the calluses on his fingers from hard work, at the way his thumb rubbed gentle circles on her skin. She thought about the past few months, about how Blake had been patient and kind, about how he had never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. She thought about the way her heart lifted when she saw him, the way his smile could change her entire day. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I have been since the day we met, and it terrifies me." Blake's face lit up with joy. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "Can I kiss you?" She nodded, and he leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was soft and sweet and perfect. Beatrice felt something inside her chest crack open, all the walls she had built around her heart, crumbling under the tenderness of his kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you," he murmured, "I will spend every day proving that you can trust me. I will never give you reason to regret this." And looking into his eyes, Beatrice believed him. Their courtship became the talk of San Pedro. Blake was a familiar figure at the boarding house, and Beatrice spent more and more time at the Double G, working on sewing projects, but also simply being near Blake. They stole moments together whenever they could, walks in the evening, picnics on the hillside, quiet conversations that stretched for hours. Mrs. Jennings watched their growing relationship with approval. "About time that boy found someone," she told Beatrice one afternoon. "He's been lonely, even if he wouldn't admit it. You're good for him." "He's good for me, too," Beatrice said, and meant it. Blake had helped her rediscover parts of herself she thought she had lost. With him, she felt brave and hopeful, capable of anything. But the mystery still haunted her, especially as she grew closer to Blake. She wanted complete honesty between them, no secrets, no unanswered questions. And yet, every time she tried to bring up the subject of her rent payment, Blake would deflect or change the subject. Finally, one evening as they sat by the ocean watching the sunset, Beatrice decided to try a different approach. "Tell me about your finances," she said. Blake looked at her in surprise. "That's a romantic topic." "I'm serious. You mentioned wanting to buy land someday. How close are you to that goal?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Not very. I've been saving, but land is expensive and my wages only go so far. It'll probably be another few years before I can afford even a small piece of property." "How much have you saved? Why do you want to know?" "Because if we're going to build a future together, I need to understand our financial situation. That's practical, not romantic." She kept her voice light, but her heart was pounding. Blake sighed. "I have about $70 in the bank. It's not much, I know, but—" "Wait." Beatrice's mind raced. $70? How much did you have 6 months ago?" His expression shuddered. "I don't remember exactly." "Blake Xavier, don't you dare lie to me. How much did you have?" "Beatrice, it doesn't matter." "It does matter. You had more than $70, didn't you? You had closer to 150 or 160, and then you spent 90 of it on." She trailed off as the pieces fell into place, as the truth she had suspected but never confirmed became undeniable. "It was you. You paid my rent." Blake didn't deny it this time. He just looked at her with those ocean eyes, waiting. "Why?" Beatrice demanded, emotion making her voice shake. "Why would you do that? You didn't even know me. That was all your savings, your dream of buying land. Why would you sacrifice that for a stranger?" "Because you needed help, and I could help you," Blake said simply. "Because leaving you to suffer when I had the means to do something felt wrong. Because—" He broke off, shaking his head. "Because what?" "Because the moment I saw you on those church steps, looking so lost and heartbroken, something in my chest shifted. I knew, Beatrice. I knew you were going to be important to me, even before we'd exchanged more than a few words. It sounds crazy, I know, but I couldn't walk away. I couldn't let you end up on the street or worse, accepting that banker's disgusting proposition." Tears were streaming down Beatrice's face now. "You gave up your dream for me." "No, I delayed my dream to help someone who had become more important than a piece of land, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat." He wiped her tears away with his thumbs. "Please don't be angry. I know you wanted to know, but I also knew you'd feel guilty or obligated if you found out. I didn't do it for gratitude or repayment. I did it because it was the right thing to do." "I'm not angry," Beatrice said, her voice breaking. "I'm overwhelmed. No one has ever done anything like that for me. No one has ever put my welfare above their own desires. Blake, that's the most incredible, selfless thing anyone has ever done. You would have done the same if our situations were reversed. I don't know if I would have. I like to think I would, but I don't know. She took his face in her hands. You're a good man, Blake Xavier, the best man I've ever known. Does this mean you forgive me for keeping it secret? There's nothing to forgive. You were trying to protect my pride, and I love you for it. The words came easily now, no fear or hesitation. I love you so much it scares me. Blake's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He kissed her, deep and passionate, pouring everything he felt into the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, Beatrice said, I'm going to pay you back, every penny. I have some savings now from the sewing work and… No. Blake, no, Beatrice. It wasn't a loan, it was a gift. You don't owe me anything. His tone was firm. But if you really want to honor what I did, then pay it forward someday. Help someone else when they need it. That's repayment enough. Beatrice thought about arguing, but she could see from his expression that he wouldn't budge on this. So instead, she nodded and let herself lean into his embrace, feeling more loved and cherished than she ever had in her life. As autumn gave way to winter and winter to spring, Blake and Beatrice's relationship deepened into something unshakable. They talked about the future with increasing specificity, about where they would live, how many children they wanted, what kind of life they would build together. Blake approached Mr. Jennings about building a small house on a corner of the ranch property, offering to pay rent until he could afford to purchase the land outright. Mr. Jennings, who had grown fond of both Blake and Beatrice, agreed immediately and even offered to help with the construction. You've been like a son to us, Mr. Jennings said, and Beatrice is good people. We'd be happy to have you both close by. Blake proposed on a warm evening in May, 1 year almost to the day after they had first met. He took Beatrice to the church steps, to the place where their story had begun, and got down on one knee with a simple gold band. I don't have much to offer you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just a half-built house, a modest income, and a heart that's completely yours. But I promise to love you fiercely and honestly for the rest of my life. Will you marry me? Beatrice didn't hesitate. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. They were married in that same church a month later, in a ceremony attended by what felt like the entire town. Mrs. Chen cried happy tears. Mrs. Jennings fussed over Beatrice's dress, which she had sewn herself from the silk Mrs. Jennings had given her. Lily served as maid of honor, and Mr. Jennings stood up with Blake. Father Miguel performed the ceremony with obvious joy, speaking about love and commitment, about the way two people could build something stronger together than they ever could apart. And when Blake kissed his bride, Beatrice felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The little house Blake had built was simple but sturdy, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. Beatrice set up a sewing corner by the window, and Blake built her a proper work table. They furnished it slowly, adding pieces as they could afford them, making it a home through the accumulation of shared memories and small domestic rituals. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Blake worked the ranch while Beatrice continued her sewing business, which had grown enough that she was turning away customers. They had dinner together every evening, talking about their days, making plans, simply enjoying each other's company. At night, Blake would hold Beatrice close and tell her all the ways he loved her, and she would trace the lines of his face in the darkness and marvel at how lucky she was to have found him. They visited the Chens regularly, and Beatrice made a point of helping other women in difficult circumstances, offering them sewing work or connecting them with resources. She never forgot what Blake had done for her, how his generosity had changed the trajectory of her life, and she was determined to pass that gift forward. 2 years into their marriage, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. Blake's reaction was pure joy, spinning her around the kitchen, despite her laughing protests to be careful. They spent the following months preparing the second bedroom as a nursery, painting the walls and building a cradle from scratch. Their son was born on a cold morning in February, healthy and loud. They named him Thomas Blake Xavier, and Blake cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the weight of love and responsibility. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, his finger engulfed by Thomas's tiny fist. "Thank you for this. For him. For everything." Beatrice watched her husband with their son and felt such profound contentment that she almost couldn't breathe. This was what she had been searching for all along, not wealth or status or social approval, but this simple, profound love that filled every corner of her life. They had another child 2 years later, a daughter they named Sarah Rose, with Beatrice's dark hair and Blake's striking eyes. Thomas was enchanted by his baby sister, insisting on helping with every aspect of her care. The house became filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, with Blake teaching Thomas to ride and Beatrice showing Sarah how to sew simple stitches. The Xavier family became a fixture in San Pedro, known for their generosity and kindness. Mr. Jennings eventually sold Blake a significant piece of land at well below market value, telling him it was payment for all the years of loyal service and hard work. Blake and Beatrice used it to expand their home and start a small horse breeding operation alongside Blake's ranch work. On their 5th anniversary, they returned to the church steps where they had first met. They sat in the same spots they had occupied that day so long ago, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked. "Giving up your savings, delaying your dreams?" Blake pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not for a single second. You and our children, this life we've built, it's better than anything I could have imagined back then. I thought land would make me happy, but I was wrong. You make me happy. Love makes me happy." "I never did properly thank you," Beatrice said, "for saving me." "You didn't need to. You saved me right back." He smiled at her, that same smile that had made her heart skip from the very beginning. "We saved each other, Beatrice. That's what love does." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, hearing the steady beat of his heart. He was right. They had saved each other, two lost souls finding home in one another. The mystery of who had paid her rent had haunted Beatrice for months after it happened. She had searched for answers with desperate determination, needing to know, to understand. And when she finally learned the truth, it had been both shocking and somehow inevitable. But sitting there in the golden light of evening, with the man she loved beside her, and the memory of their children's laughter still echoing in her ears, Beatrice understood something she hadn't all those years ago. The mystery had never been about the money, or even about who had paid it. The real mystery had been whether she would have the courage to open her heart again, to trust and love despite her fear. Blake had given her that courage. His anonymous act of kindness had kept a roof over her head, but his patient, honest love had given her something far more valuable. He had shown her what it meant to be truly known and accepted, what it meant to build a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine care. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, reading the contemplation on her face. "Just about how different my life might have been if you hadn't been at that church that day, if you hadn't cared enough to help a stranger." "I don't think I could have walked away if I'd tried," Blake admitted. "Something about you called to me from the first moment, like I'd been waiting my whole life for you to appear." "That's very romantic, Mr. Xavier. I'm a romantic man when it comes to my wife." He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, let's go home to our children." They walked hand in hand through the darkening streets, past the boarding house where Beatrice had once lived in fear of eviction, past the bank where Mr. Thornton had made his vile proposition, past the saloon and the general store, and all the places that had witnessed her struggle and her triumph. San Pedro had been a place of desperation when she arrived, a last resort for a woman with nowhere else to go. But it had become home, not because of the town itself, but because this was where she had found Blake, where they had built their life together. As they reached their house, they could see lamplight glowing in the windows. Mrs. Jennings had been watching the children, and she came to the door with Sarah on her hip and Thomas holding her hand. "There are my babies," Beatrice said, scooping Thomas up, despite his protests that he was getting too big for such treatment. Blake took Sarah from Mrs. Jennings, the little girl immediately snuggling into her father's shoulder. "They were perfect angels," Mrs. Jennings reported, though the gleam in her eyes suggested otherwise. "Thomas, do you want to tell your parents about the adventure with the chickens?" Thomas had the grace to look sheepish. "The chickens needed freedom," he announced solemnly, and Blake and Beatrice exchanged amused glances over his head. After Mrs. Jennings left and the children were bathed and settled into bed, Blake and Beatrice sat together in their small sitting room. Blake was working on a piece of leather tack, his hands sure and steady, while Beatrice mended a tear in one of Thomas's shirts. This was her favorite time of day, these quiet moments when it was just the two of them, working in companionable silence. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts or observations from their day. Other times, they simply existed together, finding peace in each other's presence. "I was thinking," Blake said, not looking up from his work, "maybe in a few years, when Thomas is old enough, we could expand the horse breeding, really make a go of it. Mr. Jennings said he'd be willing to partner with us, provide some of the initial investment in exchange for a share of the profits." "That sounds wonderful," Beatrice said. "You've always had such a way with horses. I think you'd be brilliant at it." "We'd be brilliant at it," Blake corrected. "You're as much a part of this as I am. None of this would exist without you." Beatrice set down her mending and crossed to where Blake sat. She settled onto his lap, draping her arms around his neck. "I love you," she said simply. "I know I tell you every day, but I need to make sure you know how much. You changed my life, Blake. You gave me everything." Blake set aside his work and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You gave me just as much. Before you, I was just drifting, working hard but without real purpose. You gave me a reason to build something lasting, a reason to put down roots. You gave me a family and a home and a future worth fighting for." They kissed, slow and deep, a reaffirmation of all the promises they had made to each other. And when they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness, punctuated by the normal challenges of life. There were hard winters when money was tight, summers when drought threatened the cattle, illnesses and injuries that came with ranch life. But through it all, Blake and Beatrice faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. Sarah was more outgoing, quick to laugh, and always ready for adventure. They were joined eventually by another son, Michael, born when Beatrice was 30, and then a final surprise daughter, Emma, who arrived 3 years later. The house had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Blake and Beatrice often joked that they had built their own small ranch within the larger Double J operation. The horse breeding business flourished, with Xavier horses becoming known throughout California for their quality and temperament. Beatrice's sewing business evolved as well. As her children grew, she had less time for individual commissions, but more interest in teaching. She began offering classes to other women, sharing her skills and providing them with a means to earn income. Several of her students went on to establish their own businesses, and Beatrice took pride in their success. The Xavier family became pillars of the San Pedro community. Blake served on the town council, using his position to advocate for fair wages and better working conditions for ranch hands. Beatrice organized fundraising efforts for the church and the new school, ensuring that every child in the area had access to education, regardless of their family's financial situation. And true to their promise, they never forgot the kindness that had brought them together. When they heard of someone struggling, facing eviction or hunger or illness, the Xaviers found ways to help. Sometimes it was direct financial assistance. Other times, it was offering work or connecting people with resources. They never made a show of their generosity, never sought recognition or thanks. They simply helped because they could, because they had been helped when they needed it most. On their 15th anniversary, their children arranged a surprise party. The house was filled with friends and neighbors, with the Jennings family and the Chens, with people whose lives Blake and Beatrice had touched over the years. There was music and dancing, laughter and storytelling. At one point, Father Miguel called for quiet and raised his glass in a toast. "To Blake and Beatrice Xavier," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "Two people who have shown us all what it means to love generously and live with integrity. You have built something beautiful here, not just in your family, but in the community you've helped create. We are all better for knowing you." The room erupted in cheers and agreement. Blake and Beatrice stood together, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, both overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection. "Did you ever imagine this?" Beatrice whispered to Blake as the party continued around them. "When we met on those church steps, did you imagine we'd end up here?" "I imagined hoping," Blake said. "I imagined possibilities, but this, all of this, is better than anything I dared to dream." Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Blake and Beatrice took a walk under the stars. The night was clear and warm, the kind of California evening that made it impossible to believe anywhere else in the world could be quite so perfect. They ended up at the beach, listening to the rhythm of the waves. Blake pulled Beatrice close, and they swayed together in the moonlight, dancing to music only they could hear. "Thank you," Blake said softly, "for saying yes when I proposed, for building this life with me, for giving me these 15 incredible years." "Thank you for paying my rent," Beatrice replied, the old joke still capable of making them both smile. "For seeing something in me worth saving." "I saw everything in you worth saving," Blake corrected. "Your strength, your kindness, your resilience. I saw the woman I wanted to spend my life with, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time." They stood there for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the moonlight dance on the water. And Beatrice thought about that desperate young woman she had been, clutching an eviction notice and believing her life was over. She had been so lost, so afraid, so certain that she would never find happiness or security. If she could go back and tell that younger version of herself what the future held, what would she say? That a cowboy would save her with an anonymous act of kindness? That she would fall in love and build a beautiful life in this rough coastal town? That she would find not just security, but purpose and joy and a love deeper than she had known existed? That younger Beatrice probably wouldn't have believed any of it. The pain had been too fresh, the fear too overwhelming. Sometimes you had to live through the darkness to appreciate the light that came after. But she would have wanted her to know one thing, that she was stronger than she thought, that she could survive the worst moments and come out the other side not just intact, but thriving. That love, real love, was worth the risk of heartbreak, because it could heal wounds she didn't even know she carried. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Just about how grateful I am," Beatrice said. "For all of it. The struggles and the triumphs, the hard times, and the good. All of it led me here, to this moment, with you." "I'm grateful too," Blake said, "every single day." They stayed on the beach until the moon was high overhead, talking and dreaming about the future. They discussed Thomas's interest in ranching and Sarah's artistic talents, debated whether they should add on to the house again or finally build separate quarters for the older children, planned a trip to visit Beatrice's sisters in Boston that had been years in the making, and through it all, they held each other close. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting from that chance encounter. The walk back to their house was leisurely, both reluctant to end the evening. As they approached, they could see a lamp still burning in Thomas's window. Their eldest son had taken to staying up late reading, a habit Beatrice encouraged even as it exasperated Blake. "I should go tell him to sleep," Blake said, but he made no move toward the house. "Let him read a little longer," Beatrice said. "Some of my best memories are of sneaking a book after I was supposed to be asleep." They entered the house quietly, checking on each child in turn. Michael and Emma were sound asleep, limbs sprawled in the careless abandon of childhood. Sarah had fallen asleep still clutching her drawing pencils, and Blake carefully extracted them from her grip and set them on the bedside table. Thomas looked up guiltily when they entered his room, but Beatrice just smiled and told him he could finish his chapter before lights out. In their own bedroom, Blake and Beatrice prepared for sleep with the easy familiarity of long marriage. They had shared this room, this bed, for 15 years, and the routines were as comfortable as breathing. As they lay in the darkness, Beatrice found Blake's hand and laced their fingers together. "Do you think they know how lucky they are?" she asked. "Our children?" "They know they're loved," Blake said. "That's the important thing. The rest they'll figure out as they get older. I want them to know about kindness too, about helping others and being generous. I want them to understand that sometimes small actions can change everything. They will. We'll teach them, just like we've been teaching them, not through lectures but through example." Blake rolled onto his side to face her. "They're good kids, Beatrice. They have your heart and your compassion. They'll do good things in the world." "I hope so. I hope they have even a fraction of your integrity and goodness." "Stop that," Blake said, but he was smiling. "We're both good people trying our best. That's all anyone can do." Beatrice moved closer, tucking herself against Blake's chest. His arms came around her automatically, holding her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night and every night since. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Blake replied. "Always and forever." They drifted off to sleep like that, wrapped around each other, secure in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful together. And if Beatrice's last thought before sleep claimed her was about that mysterious anonymous payment so many years ago, it was only to feel grateful that Blake had followed his instinct to help, that he had been brave enough to give without expecting anything in return, because that single act of kindness had set everything else in motion. It had given Beatrice the breathing room to survive, the security to take chances, the space to open her heart to possibility, and it had given Blake the opportunity to know her, to love her, to build a life with her. The mystery had been solved years ago, but the magic of it remained. Sometimes the smallest moments, the simplest gestures, the briefest encounters could alter the entire course of a life. Blake paying her rent had been one of those moments, a turning point disguised as an ordinary act of charity. And though Beatrice had eventually learned who her benefactor was, she had never forgotten the lesson of that anonymous gift. That true generosity asked for nothing in return. That kindness given freely, without expectation or recognition, was the purest form of love. She carried that lesson with her always, and she shared it with her children and everyone she met. And in doing so, she ensured that Blake's gift rippled outward, touching lives far beyond their own, creating waves of kindness that spread through their community and beyond. Years later, when their children were grown and starting families of their own, when Blake's hair had gone silver and Beatrice's hands were gnarled with arthritis but still steady enough to sew, they would tell their grandchildren the story of how they met. They would talk about church steps and eviction notices, about desperate prayers and unexpected rescues. The grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, asking questions and demanding details. And Blake and Beatrice would smile at each other over the children's heads, sharing a look that held decades of love and memory. The most important thing, Beatrice would tell them, is that we found each other. However it happened, whatever circumstances brought us together, we found each other, and we held on tight. And that made all the difference. The second most important thing, Blake would add, his eyes twinkling, is that when you see someone who needs help and you have the means to help them, you do it. You don't wait for permission or recognition. You just help, because that's what good people do. And the children would nod solemnly, absorbing the lesson, carrying it forward into their own lives and their own futures. But that was still years away. On this night, their 15th anniversary, Blake and Beatrice were still young enough to dream of many more years ahead, still strong enough to work the ranch and raise their children, still deeply in love with each other and the life they had built. The moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, painting everything in shades of silver. Beatrice watched the play of light and shadow on Blake's sleeping face, tracing the lines that age and sun and laughter had etched there. He was even more handsome now than he had been at 25, his face carrying the character and depth that only a life well lived could provide. She thought about that first meeting, how she had been at her lowest point, and he had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known she was praying. She thought about the mystery that had consumed her for months, the desperate need to know who had saved her. She thought about the relief and wonder she had felt when she finally learned the truth, but mostly, she thought about gratitude. For Blake's generous heart, for the courage to love again, for the beautiful family they had created together, for every moment of joy and struggle that had brought them to this place. The mystery of her anonymous benefactor had been solved long ago, but the real mystery, the one that never stopped amazing her, was how one person's kindness could change everything, how a cowboy paying a stranger's rent could lead to a love story that spanned decades, to a family that would carry their legacy forward, to a community made better by their presence. That was the real magic, not the money itself, but what it represented: faith in humanity, belief in second chances, the recognition that we are all connected and that helping another person helps us all. Blake stirred in his sleep, unconsciously pulling Beatrice closer. She smiled and let herself relax fully into his embrace, safe and loved and home. The story of how Beatrice Ann's rent came to be paid would remain a cherished family legend, told and retold through the generations. But the greater story, the one written in every day they spent together, in every act of kindness they extended to others, in every child and grandchild who carried their values forward, that story was still being written. And it was a story of love, not just romantic love, though that was certainly part of it, but the bigger love that sees someone in need and responds with generosity, the love that builds communities and changes lives, the love that transforms desperate situations into new beginnings. Beatrice had come to San Pedro as a broken woman with an eviction notice and no future. She had been saved by an anonymous cowboy whose kindness asked for nothing in return, and in learning to accept that gift, in opening her heart to love again, she had found everything she never knew she was searching for. The mystery had mattered for a time, but what mattered more was what came after. The love that grew between two people who had both been lost and found each other. The family they built together. The life they created from nothing but hope and hard work and unwavering commitment to each other. And as Beatrice finally drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the evidence of their love in the form of sleeping children down the hall and a home filled with memories and joy, she knew with absolute certainty that she was the luckiest woman alive. Not because her rent had been paid, though that had certainly been fortunate. Not even because she had married a good man, though Blake was the best man she had ever known. No, she was lucky because she had learned the most important lesson life had to offer. That love given freely, without expectation or demand, was the most powerful force in the world. That one act of kindness could ripple outward endlessly, changing lives in ways the giver might never know. Blake had given her that gift, and in return, she had given him her heart, her life, her unwavering partnership. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their individual struggles. Together, they had created a legacy of love and generosity that would outlive them both. The mystery was solved, the rent was paid, and the love story, the one that mattered most, lived on in every sunrise they watched together, every challenge they overcame side by side, every moment of joy they shared with their children and their community. It was a story that began with desperation and rescue, but it became so much more. It became a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of partnership, and the transformative nature of love. And though Beatrice never forgot the fear and uncertainty of those early days in San Pedro, never forgot the despair of holding that eviction notice or the shock of learning her debt had been anonymously paid, what she remembered most was what came after: the courtship and the wedding, the building of their home and the birth of their children, the quiet moments and the grand adventures, the struggles and the triumphs, all of it woven together into a life she wouldn't trade for anything in the world. Blake Xavier had paid her rent, yes. But more than that, he had given her back her belief in goodness, in possibility, in love. And she had given him the same in return. That was the real mystery and the real magic. Two broken people finding each other and discovering that together they were whole. That was the story that mattered, the one worth telling, the one that would echo through the years long after they were gone. And it all started with a cowboy who paid a stranger's rent and asked for nothing in return, not because he expected gratitude or recognition, not because he thought it would lead to anything more, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes that's all it takes to change a life, to change everything. One act of kindness, one moment of compassion, one cowboy who cared enough to help, and a woman brave enough to accept that help and build something beautiful from it. That was their story, and it was a story of love.